What's up? So we got another item review. This one is on like I'm doing this one because it's been so highly requested, which I wasn't really expecting, because it's a really expensive item. It's a peripheral stat item, and it's an item that I figure just a lot of people probably didn't own or weren't looking at yet, but they do seem to be, and that's interesting. So we're gonna talk about the Nikes on my feet today, the Jordans, so to speak, the Avernic treads. The Avernic treads max is what we're going to be really focusing on here. The non-max Avernic treads are just for people who are, well, pures, I guess. And then I guess if you're on a budget, but that doesn't really make sense because if you're on like a tight budget, you probably aren't wearing Avernic treads because they're so freaking expensive. So let's start talking about Avernic treads. We'll start with the header. So Avernic treads are 214 mil right now, November 2025 at base. So that's just for the treads themselves, and then 276 mil for the max version, which is taking into account the price of primordial boots, Pegasian boots, and eternal boots, as well as 12,000 demon tiers, which you have to use to create the max version, which has increased stats. The stats you see down here are for the max version. If it was the non-max version, these would all be the same, except for melee strength would be +4, range strength, I forget if it's +2 or +1. Let me look that up real quick. Avernic treads, OSRS. The base version has +2 range strength, so it would be +2 range strength instead of +3, and then it would be +1% magic strength as opposed to +2%. So, still pretty strong, but obviously, if it like the strength stats are like the most relevant stats. So if you're trying to get the most out of them, then yeah, you want to get the upgraded version for sure. So these are tribrid boots. Tribrid meaning that they are like appealing to all three styles. They have bonuses for all three styles, whereas before these boots came out, all of the boots that we have were style specific. This is going to have some implications for what type of content they excel at and what type of content they don't make as big of a difference at, but we'll talk about that, I guess, now, because we're pretty much at that point. So let's go to the main slide. So we've got the Avernic treads here. There's a lot of info here. We'll start on the left. So the stats versus the boots like that we had before, like the next best boots, are really important because it's a little bit different between styles. So you'll notice there's +3 attack bonus, accuracy bonus for every boot, which is a small but in some cases relevant difference, but we mainly want to look at the strength here because it's a little different between styles. So the stats versus primordials, it has +1 strength bonus. That's not really all that much. So if you don't know, barring like particular weapon passives or multipliers and stuff, in most cases, if you are 99 in a stat, have it boosted through a potion, and have the max prayer on, it's about every 4.5 strength bonus that gives you a max hit. Now, in some cases, like T-Bow that has a multiplier, it can give you multiple max hits every 4.5 strength bonus. In some cases, like the Fang, because it has a negative max hit multiplier, it takes like 6 strength bonus to give you a max hit. But generally speaking, with most weapons that don't have those weird multipliers, every 4.5 strength bonus is going to give you a max hit. So +1 strength bonus actually isn't that much. So for melee, specifically versus primordials, these make a smaller difference versus other styles. Because when we look at range, it has +3 strength. So that's like almost a full max hit bracket. And depending on the weapon, like I said, if we're talking about like a twisted bow, it could be 2 to 3 max hits. So yeah, 3 strength bonus is quite a bit. So for range, they're pretty solid. And then stats versus Eternals, you'll notice it's +1% magic strength as opposed to the normal strength value. That's because magic uses percents as opposed to actual strength bonus. Now, this percentage is relevant because if we're talking about a shadow, this is actually +3% because it gets tripled. But for most magic weapons, it is just +1%. So that's like ultimately not that much. Usually it takes about 2 to 3, anywhere from 2 to 3% is going to give you a max hit on normal magic weapons. And then for a shadow, obviously it being +3%, it's like almost definitely going to give you a max hit, perhaps even 2 in some cases. So for shadow, really good. For a non-shadow, not so good versus Eternals. So let's talk about content where treads make a bigger difference. So this is going to be primarily content where you switch a lot, and the reason treads make a bigger difference at this type of content, like I'm trying to give you an idea overall in this video of when you should try to buy treads. And that's really hard to answer though, because I don't know what type of content you in particular like to do. And that makes a very big difference in terms of how worthwhile treads are for you as an upgrade. I will say in general, treads are a late upgrade because they are a statistical upgrade, a small one, and also a very, very expensive item. Treads come very late in the item progression. Since Doom came out, I've actually seen a lot of people walking around in like bandos and a Nox halberd and like a fire cape and a face guard and like potentially not even a rancor, like maybe like a torturer, and they're wearing Avernic treads, and that just doesn't make sense to me. But we'll talk about that more when we get to the items over here on the right. For now, let's focus on the content where treads make a bigger difference. So content where you switch a lot, treads are going to make a bigger difference, and the reason is because at that type of content, you would just be wearing, if you don't have treads, you'd be having to choose between one of these three boots. And so, like, let's say you're at TOA, for example. I've got some DPS calculations pulled up that we can look at. Let's say you're at Cox, for example, and you're fighting Great Olm's Mage Hand, and you're using a Shadow Invertus. In this situation, because you have to choose between one of these three boots if you don't have treads, you'd probably be wearing Primordials, because you probably had to fight like Tecton at some point. You're going to have to fight the melee hand when the Mage Hand goes down. Oh, sorry, you actually can't see this. Oh, sorry. There, fix that. So you'd probably wear Primordials, but if you have treads, you get to wear boots that benefit you in all three styles. So because of that, when you're using your magic weapon, you get the full benefit of the treads because it's like versus Primordials. So because of that, it's like a 5% upgrade when you're fighting the Mage Hand at Ulm. So it makes like a bigger difference at content where you switch a lot because you don't have to choose just one boot for one style. You get a boot that's good on all three. So at Cox, at TOA, that makes a pretty big difference. Like at TOA, it makes a pretty big difference here against Kefri. Like, you'd be probably wearing Eternals if you have a Shadow at TOA because you want that magic damage bonus for your Shadow. But if you have treads, you don't have to worry about choosing. So you get the bonus on your Fang of all that strength bonus that it gives versus, Eternals that give none. So that's almost 5% against Kefri. So yeah, it makes a bigger difference at that type of content. Now you still have to keep in mind here that we're talking about treads, and treads, like, making a big difference is like 5% damage, which is that's hinting at the fact that these are like a peripheral statistical upgrade and not like a huge weapon upgrade or something like that. So 5% damage for 270 mil is a pretty steep price point, and that's why I say treads do generally come pretty late in the progression, but that is, by the standards of what treads can do, a pretty big difference, about 5%. And then Doom, depending on the setup, at Doom, these can make up to a 2%, a 2 max hit difference on Scorching Bow setups. It can be a 0 max hit difference, depending on your setup. It depends. Like, if you have an Assembler and Void and an Anguish, I'm pretty sure it makes no max hit difference to wear treads versus any other range boot. But if you have a Quiver, and Void and an Anguish and a Scorching Bow, I'm pretty sure it makes a 1 max hit difference. That's decent. And then if you have, like, I don't know, some other type of setup, it can make like potentially a 2 max hit difference on a Scorching Bow. Maybe you don't have 99 range. In some cases, it can make a 2 max hit difference. Now, in max range and Void, so like Quiver, Anguish, Void, T-Bow, because we're talking about max range, versus like treads versus Pegasians and max range, it is a 3 max hit difference to have the Avernic treads. T-Bow has that huge multiplier, so it can potentially make up to 3 max hit difference just to have the treads on. So yeah, Doom, depending on setup, they can make a pretty big difference there. And that's why I also say they make a bigger difference in situations where you're using a Twisted Bow. Because they have that 3 strength difference versus Pegasians, like at Hydra, for example, they pretty much always make a 2 max hit difference at Hydra. Because that Twisted Bow has that big multiplier, that's a lot of strength bonus, you're probably going to get a max hit bracket out of it, and then it's probably going to be multiple max hits because of Twisted Bow's big multiplier. Where they make a smaller difference is at places where you don't switch as much, or places that are melee centric because they're not as strong versus primordials as they are versus other boots. So that's going to be like Taub, where you're mostly using melee at Taub. In situations where you're blowpiping a lot, depending on your setup, you might blowpipe like Maiden and Zarpus as well as Nilo. And in that situation, it's obviously a little bit more important to have treads because they give you a lot of range strength. But at Taub in general, you're mostly meleeing. And so as a result, treads don't make as big of a difference at Taub. I got some stuff pulled up here to illustrate the differences at Taub. So let's say you got like a scythe, Bandos and stuff. You do have an Ultor ring because I think it makes sense to have an Ultor ring before treads. It's 4 strength bonus as opposed to just 1. Obviously, it depends on what type of content you do. If you don't do as much melee content, maybe it doesn't make sense for you. But I would say if you're doing like tons of Taub and you're like a Taub rat mainly, then it makes sense to have an Ultor ring before treads, definitely. So let's say you got all this stuff and you're just wearing the differences. You got treads versus primordials on your feet. It's a 2% difference on Verzik P2, basically, if you have the scythe. And if you have like a Nox Halberd or something like a whip or a Soul Reaper axe, it's like an even smaller difference, I'm pretty sure. Let's look at that real quick. Yeah, less than 1% difference if you're running a Nox Halberd with a similar setup. That's because it doesn't even give you a max hit in that situation, as it usually doesn't versus Primordials, because it's just 1 strength bonus. On the Scythe, it does give you 1 max hit, but that's not very much by the standards of a Scythe, and so that's for that reason it's only 2% difference. So yeah, at Taub, not as big of a deal to have treads because you're not doing as much switching out of melee. And then melee only bosses, so we're talking like Vorkath, Vardorvis, Duke, all these bosses, like I've got Vorkath pulled up here. It makes like here's treads versus primordials in like Bandos, Rancor, Berserker Ring, Ferocious Gloves, all that stuff versus treads versus primordials. You got less than 0.5% difference. It's making almost no difference at Vorkath. And then I've got Vardorvis pulled up here somewhere. Here's Vardorvis. In this situation, it's not actually just treads versus primordials. I wanted to illustrate kind of what else you can buy with all of the money that you would spend on treads. And so in this situation, I've got treads and Bandos over here on the right with a Nox Halberd, and then I've got primordials and Oathplate and a Nox Halberd over here on the left. So Oathplate top and bottom versus treads. It's 6% more damage to have the Oathplate top and bottom versus spending your money on the treads. And you'd actually have quite a bit of money left over. I think like 100 mil left over buying that. So yeah, pretty big upgrade. And then if we go like Bandos, if we take it even further here, let's say that you you take that treads money and instead of putting it towards Oathplate, you put it towards a Soul Reaper axe, the best in slot weapon at Vard, which is cheaper than Avernic treads. Almost, it's over 10% difference that you're going to benefit more out of the Soul Reaper axe. So yeah, that's another example. And then let's talk about ranged here a little bit. I have one more calculation pulled up for ranged. So if like people tend to give it a lot of reputation as a really good ranged upgrade, and that's because, like I said, 3 range strength is quite a bit, and so it is true that it's a bigger ranged upgrade. But just to show you here, if you're doing like Bandos with a Bofa, yeah, it is 3.5% difference, but that's again for 270 mil. And if we actually look at this here, if I replace these Barrows gloves with Strike Van braces on the non-tread setup, it's almost just as good. And if I do this instead, if I give it a Venator ring, because you're usually not speccing stuff at Bandos, it's actually better. Yeah, and the Venator ring costs like less than 40 mil. I think it's like 35 mil versus the 270 mil for the treads. So yeah, it's a really good ranged upgrade, but it is a really expensive one, and it is still like 1 max hit on most setups, and not even all setups. Sometimes it's not even a max hit. So yeah, that's the standards that we're working with treads. So as a result, we'll come to the stuff here on the right, which I think is probably going to be the most useful for most people, which are the items that I want to compare it to. Again, I don't know exactly what type of content you like to do, so that's why I say stuff like definitely, like almost definitely, as opposed to definitely, or items that probably, or items that come at a similar point. I'm being kind of vague because I have to. I don't know what type of content you do specifically. If you don't ever do stuff where you're meleeing bosses, then it doesn't make sense for you to get like Oathplate, like an Oathplate top, before you get Avernic Treads potentially. I mean, if it's a really extreme case and you just never ever use slash or melee stuff, then yeah, that could potentially be the case for you. If you don't ever go places where you would use a Zerite crossbow, like you don't do Doom at all, you don't do TOA at all, then it probably comes before Treads, but maybe not. I'll start at the top though. Items that almost definitely come before Treads. So these are items that just give you pound for pound more stuff, like more stat upgrade than Avernic Treads do. Stuff like Confliction Gauntlets, which give you 2% magic damage over a Torture. These just give you 1% magic damage over Eternals, and then Confliction Gauntlets also have that really sick passive, where if you're using a one-handed magic weapon, it rolls your accuracy twice if you miss. That makes a huge difference on certain bosses, and so as a result, it's like pound for pound a much better magic upgrade, and you're pretty much always taking a magic hand switch and a melee glove switch or range switch, like potentially Barrow's gloves that you're using for both, but you'll still take like Barrow's gloves and a Tormented, even in that situation. So because you're already taking a magic hand switch, it's really like you can't give it the Tribrid benefit quite as much, because you're going to be taking a magic hand switch no matter what. And so as a result, the Confliction Gauntlets get to like fully flex their benefit over this benefit versus Eternals, and it's just a lot more that you get out of Confliction Gauntlets. Same with Rancor. It gives you like 2 strength bonus and like 10 accuracy or 15 accuracy. I think it's 10. Over a Torture, 10 is a lot of accuracy, and 2 strength bonus is obviously more than 1. So as a result, in stuff where you're meleeing, Rancor being a lot cheaper, like both of these items are like less than half the price, I think like a third of the price of Avernic Treads, then yeah, Rancor is like generally a better upgrade. Avernic Defender, even though it's not refundable, this item gives you 5 attack bonus and 2 strength bonus over a Dragon Defender, which is just more pound for pound than these boots tend to give. And it's also way, way cheaper. So as a result, these are all items that I put in the category of items that almost definitely come before Treads. Like if you have Treads but you don't have one of these items, you know your situation better than me, but I would think it's probably questionable. Like maybe you never ever use magic. In that case, maybe it makes sense you don't have Confliction Gauntlets. But for the most part, I would think you'd have these items before you'd have Treads. I would also say it's true for these items, just like less surely. Like these are items that probably come before Treads. Oathplate top and bottom. I would think you probably get that before you get Avernic Treads, unless you just never ever use like fight / weak bosses, or just never use melee. Because the Oathplate is just like I showed you at Vardorvis, almost 6% better than the Avernic Treads and also way cheaper. So I think that if you're fighting bosses that are weak to slash almost ever, like if you're doing Taub, if you're doing Vardorvis, if you're doing Duke, I would think this comes before Treads, definitely. And then I would put Ultor Ring also in this category. If you're pretty much ever doing stuff that involves melee, I would think you'd have an Ultor Ring before Treads. Because Ultor Ring is 4 strength bonus over a Berserker Ring I, which is more than the Treads offer you by a lot. And then the Zerite Crossbow, if you're doing Doom, for example, like that's the main thing I was thinking of when I put this here. If you do Doom at all, like the Zerite Crossbow is a huge difference maker at Doom. And the Treads are like at most 3 max hits, which is a lot. That's only if you're using max Twisted Bow. In most cases it's 1, maybe 2, but also maybe 0 max hits to have the Treads. Whereas the Zerite Crossbow is making just that massive difference for you that's going to let you skip orb phases almost all the time. If you're doing TOA, Zerite Crossbow is a big difference maker at TOA. Avernic Treads are only slightly cheaper than a Zerite Crossbow. This is like the most unsure item in this category. Like, I could see you having Avernic Treads before a Zerite Crossbow, depending on your situation, but it's still, I wanted to put it here. Unless you just never do Doom or TOA, and then you have no place to use a Zerite Crossbow. Or Nex. Nex is a very important one to mention there too. If you do Nex, this definitely comes before Treads, the Zerite Crossbow. But yeah, if you don't do any of those 3 pieces of content at all, then there's really no place you'd use a Zerite Crossbow. That's like the one exception. But yeah, this makes a much bigger difference at the content where you do use it than the Treads. And then Ancestral Hat, this is specifically the hat, because the hat is like 50 mil, which is a lot. It's like 200 mil less than Avernic Treads, and it gives you the same benefit versus Eternals of that 1% magic strength. I would think like this is particularly for people who have a shadow. If you have a shadow, I would definitely get this hat before I would get these treads, just because it's 200 mil cheaper. So that's like a lot of money that you could put towards other stuff potentially, and it gives you almost the same benefit for your shadow to get the hat versus a Vertus mask, as opposed to getting the treads over your Eternals. Obviously, these like give you the benefit of the melee hybrid stuff, but I don't think that that's really like that mainly comes into play at TOA. Because at TOA is the main place where you're going to be like, you would be wearing Eternals otherwise, and then like, instead you get so you get the full melee benefit. And at TOA you're using a Fang. So even 6 strength bonus doesn't even always give you a max hit on a Fang. And at most it gives you 1. So yeah, it's like not as big of a deal basically. And I would just have the hat probably before I would get the boots. Items that come at a similar point to treads, I do have the ancestral top here because the top's like a lot more expensive, but it's about the same benefit as the hat versus a Vertus top. So like it's like 100 mil to upgrade to this over a Vertus top. Out of the 3 items I have here, this is like the one that probably comes soonest. Like I say, these are items that come at a similar point to treads. This probably comes the soonest out of these 3 items. So it's like the least certain that you're gonna like put this off until after treads, basically. But still, I would say like it comes at a similar point to treads. It's when you have a shadow and you have a bunch of money sitting around and you're looking for a good stat upgrade. That's when you're looking at an ancestral top, maybe a Avernic Treads. I would in most cases go with the top before that. If you don't have a shadow, then both of these items are pretty much not worth it for you. Like there's a lot of stuff you could still put your money towards if you don't have a shadow yet, like being the cheapest of the mega rares by a mile. If you don't have a shadow yet, there's probably a lot of other stuff your money could go towards, and these 2 items make a very small difference for you on your magic setups. Very small difference for you. So yeah, but if you have a shadow, then these are 2 items you could come at a crossroads where you're considering choosing between. I would usually choose the top, but in some situations it makes sense to choose the boots. Like maybe you do a ton of hybrid bosses, like I said. And in that situation, maybe the boots are better than the top. You stick with a Vertus top and buy the boots instead for a while. Zerite Van Braces, I feel like are the best comparison for the Avernic Treads. If your account is at a point where you are considering getting Zerite Van Braces, and you're not like somebody who's like almost always doing range content, you do like a wide variety of content, and you're considering Zerite Van Braces, that's where your account's at a point where you might also consider Avernic Treads. Because Zerite Van Braces are very well known as like a very late game small stat upgrade. That's what the Avernic Treads are. They're a very expensive, very late game, small stat upgrade. So I feel like Zerite Van Brace is like the best single item I could compare the Avernic Treads to in terms of where you should, like when your account's ready to start looking at them. The Torva Full Helm, I feel like is also a really good comparison point. Like, obviously, like the Torva Full Helm, you're comparing to a Natives Not Face Guard or an Oathplate Helm most of the time. It costs a lot of money to upgrade to a Torva Helm over that item. We're talking like 180 mil, like 160 mil. That's a lot of money, and it only gives you 2 strength bonus versus those items. So yeah, that's like a very small upgrade for the price point. And that's what Avernic Treads offer you, basically. It is like a relevant upgrade when you're at a point where you should be owning most of the stuff in the game, but yeah, it is small and it is expensive, and that's what a Torva Full Helm offers. That's what the Avernic Treads offers. So that's my long and short for where I think Avernic Treads fit into the progression. Is it's very late. Like I couldn't even make a section here for items that like you probably buy after treads, because treads are really one of the last items that you should be buying. Like they come very late in the, like maybe not the last item. Like maybe you'll have them before a Torva Full Helm. I could see that. Maybe before Zerite Van Braces, maybe I could see that. But very late. Like they come very late because they're very, very expensive. And while their stat benefits are nice, it's just so expensive that you have to compare that to what else you could put that money towards. Like items that almost definitely come before treads, I would also put in this category any significant weapon upgrade. I would also put in this category any significant spec weapon upgrade. Like if you have Avernic Treads, but you don't have a Void Waker or Dragon Claws or even Burning Claws, like, that's ridiculous, in my opinion. Like, especially the Burning Claws. Obviously, you probably have those. But if you don't have Dragon Claws or a Void Waker before Avernic Tread, and you have Avernic Treads, I would consider that kind of questionable. Because those spec weapons, while they do make a kind of small difference, do make a bigger difference than the small stat upgrade Avernic Treads give you. And so as a result, I would say those almost definitely, or at least probably, come before Treads. And any, like, main hand upgrade, like an Eye of Ayak versus a Sang, definitely have that before Treads. We're talking about, like, potentially, like, maybe a Soul Reaper axe if you're comfortable using it. Put the asterisk there because it does have that HP thing. But if you're really good at the content and you're comfortable using it, a Soul Reaper axe, like, if you're doing like melee bosses a lot, makes sense before Treads because it makes a much bigger upgrade in terms of your DPS versus what Treads are going to offer for less money. And then what else is a good comparison? So range is really hard to talk about. There's there's not a lot of range stuff here because it's just hard to talk about range progression and put Masori in here somewhere because it's pretty much you're using Crystal with your Bofa until you make that big leap to T-Bow. And then Masori is really good for you, and it makes sense for you. But until you get to that point, it's just completely useless to you, almost, because you're using Crystal everywhere. So, yeah, that's why it's hard to pin range down with this progression. But in general, like, these make a really big difference for a T-Bow, the Treads do. For most ranged weapons, though, it's still kind of small. It's usually just one max hit. So yeah, like, that's why I still put, like, Xeric Crossbow is probably before Treads. I don't know, though. So I'm kind of repeating myself at this point. The main long and short of the video is that Treads are very, very expensive for a statistical upgrade. A rather, I'm not going to say small, but it's a peripheral statistical upgrade. It's like 1 max hit, 2 max hits potentially, and sometimes even 0. And that's for 70 mil, which is a lot of money. So as a result, it's definitely a very late progression item, and something you shouldn't be buying really that early into your account. Buying these before mega rares, it's I could see it in some cases, like while you're saving up for the mega rare, but you'll probably want to be at a point where you'll want to sell these so you can get the mega rare at some point, and that does not refund the demon tiers. That's only like 2.5 mil that you lose, so it's not that big of a deal. Like, the tax is going to cost you more than that, but it is something to consider. I would say, like, putting your money into these and being like, I'm never going to sell these, but I don't have, like, a Twisted Bow yet. I don't know, man. That's just not the way I would do it. Not the way I would do it. I would personally either not buy these until I have a Twisted Bow, or I would sell these at some point. More likely I'd do this. I would sell them at some point so I could afford my Twisted Bow. Definitely is the route I would go. But, it's everyone's situation is different. It depends on the content you do. These boots, though, are like, a small stat upgrade, a peripheral stat upgrade, I should say, for 260 mil, 270 mil, which is a lot of money. So yeah, that's the main long and short of my take on the Avernic Treads. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.